me great pleasure to introduce you to my friend, Dr. Ken Boa.
Great to be with you, and we're going to be looking at a lot of slides. I go very quickly through my slides, so I'm going to keep it pretty active for you, but I'm going to be looking at a number of things, science, faith, and reason, and to give you an overview, we're going to be looking at worldviews and paradigms, and key things, 4 fundamental principles or features of the world that really point ultimately to God, and at the end of the day, the implications for these. And so in doing that, we're looking at this whole idea of worldviews and paradigms, and how do we understand that? And the typical mindset that people have is that science is inimical to faith. It's a very common understanding. The illusion is that the atheist lives by science or by reason alone, but that the theist must live without evidence is one of the suppositions. Or both embrace a worldview, though, that faith requires faith to understand when you stop and think about it. In fact, the atheist has to believe that the universe is ordered and it's rational, has to believe that his mind can actually correspond with reality. But atheism provides no philosophical framework for those assumptions. At the end of the day, those operational beliefs are needed, but they do not work because it implies that our minds are just byproducts of random processes in the first place. So it's a very intriguing understanding of seeing how the world really is. And indeed, we see that science only appeared once in human history, empirically based science only once. There was technology, yes, in Babylonia, and there was technology in China, and there was technology in Greece. There was technology in these areas, but no such thing as science as we came to understand it. It was actually occurs for the first time in the history of the planet in Europe, in the Renaissance in Christian Europe. And the understanding is that the universe is rational and can be studied. And so this understanding is that the universe can be seen and understood and comprehended in a very real way. Whereas, for example, the Eastern philosophies of Hinduism and also of Buddhism would never have originated science because they taught that the universe is an illusion. And the idea that the universe is an illusion, as in polytheism, science wouldn't be explored at all in polytheism because it was part of the creation. But the idea of the illusion doesn't work, and so it requires more. It's a kind of a worldview that ultimately led to this. And the theistic understanding features the idea of the Logos, you see, a mind who ordered and organized all things together. So far from being incompatible, the fact that in science and faith working together, it's a reasonable faith. And when we look at that sequence, the progenitors of science, when we think about, for example, these exemplars including Copernicus and Galileo, William Harvey, Blaise Pascal, Isaac Newton, Joseph Priestley, Michael Faraday, Louis Pasteur, and Gregor Mendel. That's a pretty impressive lineup. And they're all basically in the theistic camp. So it tells us something, that they saw themselves as committed believers. They saw their science as an act of worship rather than something that's incompatible. Theism then is not only compatible with, but it's the thing that provides a worldview that gives it sustenance and clarity and coherence. So here's what's happened, though, in our own time, especially in the late 19th century, that science was being redefined as something very different. Science was redefined to become not just the scientific method, but the assumptions of naturalistic, the idea of methodological naturalism, that we just don't want to attribute anything of design agency, is a way of eliminating things, and it kind of, as a consequence, brought us away from an understanding of the world as it needs to be seen. It has to be a method that uses inference to the best explanation, is what we're saying, rather than a God that doesn't exist. And so in understanding this, then, we see that here, the universe, matter, energy, time, and space, that ultimate reality is not God or anything spiritual. So it redefines science. And my claim is that science needs to be correctly redefined. And correctly being redefined is to say, it's actually go where the evidence leads you. Use inference to the best explanation. Go where the evidence leads. And that, to me, is an important understanding of the way science needs to be conceived and construed. Indeed, there are various kinds of science, and the mistake of scientism is the supposition that everything that's true must be scientifically demonstrable. And so that has led to a real distortion, because actually there are many kinds of knowledge. Besides science, you're going to have as well the realm of historical knowledge, and then each has its own epistemology. You're going to have the realm of personal knowledge and moral knowledge and philosophical knowledge and relational knowledge. And so all of these things, aesthetic, all of these have their own epistemology, their own point of origin, their understanding, and not one of them is dominant over the others, but all of them matter, and they all connect together. And so none of them are exhaustive. So the mistake would be to say that if it's not scientific as we define it, it can't be true, because we live better than that, and actually there's a bigger and richer understanding of the way life is meant to be that we can see in a theistic realm. Now, concerning inference to the best explanation, if the inference supports design, so be it. The claim that the quest for design will kill science is simply not something that's really correct. The error is that design theory is the same as theology, is the supposition. But there are numerous and growing numbers of design theorists who are not even theists. And so one of those is Professor Thomas Nagel, who wrote this significant line in his book. It potentially can be scientific to argue that the claim that the data of DNA and life points to an intelligent designer, even if science cannot tell you the identity of the designer, which is an astonishing thing for him to make, and to make a claim. And so we're seeing a person here who is at least open to that possibility of design agency of some sort. And so when we look at a spectrum of design theorists, it ranges all the way through the spectrum, from the Nagel's position to a six-day creationism. But the thing that they have as a big tent is that they all agree in something that's very specific, namely the idea of design. So what they share in common, it may be the details and so forth are going to be differing, but there's going to be different understandings of what that looks like. And here is, I would put Einstein more toward the deistic side of things. His was the God of Spinoza, more or less, because he did believe in a super intellect. And so we have that. Another person that I was privileged to meet years ago in Dallas, Texas, was Anthony Flew, who was the Richard Dawkins of earlier decades and wrote many books to refute the idea of God's existence. And the astonishing thing, at the age of 82 years old, this man said, all my books were wrong. I still can't get over that. How can a man achieve that? I admire a man who says I was wrong. And if I had to do it over again, I would change it. And you know what made him change that? It was the realization that the entire genetic code, when we understand the nature of it, that there's more information contained in the 6 feet of your DNA in each of your 40 to 100 trillion cells than there is in several sets of encyclopedias. And he moved from atheism to deism. And you don't know, I pray that he would have come to faith in Jesus at the end, because he was a man who was a seeker after that truth. And so he, in fact, understood that there had to be a superintelligence of God. So that's an incredible thing. So the whole idea of there are various kinds of sciences that we know already distinguish design from accident. It's not that this is some innovative idea, that design can't be considered as an option for our understanding. But rather, we can see several of these things. And so when we consider, for example, the whole realm of cryptology or intellectual property law, and so we're looking at these insurance claims investigation, was it in fact something that was arson, or was it an accident? So you have to determine, was there design involved or was it accidental? You see the same thing is going to be true in cryptology, It's going to be true as well in artificial intelligence. As well, you're going to see it in archaeology. Was this a tool, or does it just look like a tool? So you have to discern one thing for another, and there are criteria in archaeology to help us understand that. It's also true with random number generation, and in particular, SETI, the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. We're looking for a series of primes in the radio sequences. And the idea of searching for extraterrestrial intelligence means that there's something that they're looking for that evinces design. And so we can discern the difference. We have clear ways of understanding the design inference. And I'm arguing then that with all of these, random number generation as well, but with all of these, we're not saying design is creation 2.0 as many people might suppose, but it's really design is go where the evidence leads. And if I see a turtle on a fence post, for example, what do you have to conclude? You only have a few options. And one of them, it just happened to be there. Just the wind blew it up there, you see. And it's not the best solution that you have to the problem. You see, it didn't have to be there. The wind, maybe a gust of wind popped them. Wouldn't it might be better to consider that somebody put it there? You see, the implicit agency. And that's what we're go where the evidence leads. And the momentum of evidence continues to grow in so many ways. There are design theory predictions that you have that you can see greater complexity, greater elegance, greater information, not less. And so with technology, as we now understand it, there's a growth in that understanding of how much there is that we can know. And so all of these things then work together and forge an understanding of predictions that we can actually make. And one of those was, in fact, that when it was found that only 2% of the DNA in your body is actually related to the genetic dynamic of forming proteins, the assumptions that some made is it must be junk DNA, the rest of it, you see. And design agents, theorists, though, said there's going to be some purpose for that. It's going to be a higher level. And so it has been seen more and more as we've gone by. It wasn't junk at all. It was an arrogant assumption that because you didn't know what it does, it's got to be junk. But intelligent design theorists said it wasn't junk, but it's actually elegant function. Indeed, there are multiple layering components that we have non-coding DNA that functions at higher level operating systems. And you can also predict other things from the material. You're going to expect growing in irreducible complexity in biology, design theory, the abrupt appearance in the fossil record of new species followed by stasis and extinction. And these and other things can be tested and they can be confirmed. So there's a momentum of evidence that I see of deeper complexity, not less. So we live in a time where science and technology are actually becoming force multipliers of actual the revelation of the one who made it all. So it's actually working in the favor of a theistic vision of what life is meant to be about. This momentum of evidence continues to grow. Now, the first feature of the world that I want to give you is going to be the evidence for the universe's beginning. And there's an if proposition that I would like to give you then. The if proposition is if anything exists now, then something must be eternal, or something not eternal must have emerged from nothing. And so we have these possibilities. So you have the universe is an illusion, the universe is eternal, you have the universe is something that's always existed, or it's going to be something that was created by, emerged from nothing, or created by an eternal being. Now, as to this simple thing, to understand the nature of the universe and how it came into being, if it's an illusion, it has very little to commend it, because even the full-blown atheist, Hindu, who believes that life is an illusion, God's play, Lila, Maya, that even he has to look both ways before crossing the street, you see. So when I see that kind of a person, that they know they live better than their philosophy, because it's like the person who says, I can't speak a complete sentence in English. And they just did so, you see. And so it defeats itself. It's not livable, and it doesn't really make any sense. And we, as image bearers, live better than our worldviews if it's a non-theistic worldview, because we have bearers of the image of God. But then the second is the possibility. So it's not something that is an illusion. What about it being an eternal one? And so this is where Fred Hoyle came in with the steady state theory idea for a period of time, where he was supposing that perhaps matter and energy has always existed, and in fact, that as a result of continuous creation, at the edge of the cosmos, new energies were being formed so that the universe would not wear out. But that's really quite a faith assumption without any warrant for it, and it violates the first and second laws of thermodynamics. Among other things, how's your theory working for you? So it's really a faith proposition that does not work very well, and Hoyle has later changed his position accordingly. And so this whole idea of moving away from that to the next idea of the universe being eternal. And when Edwin Hubble discovered that the universe was actually expanding uniformly in all directions, it led others to develop the so-called Big Bang theory, which was a pejorative term at the time. But the idea of a hot Big Bang, that if you go backwards in time, there was a starting point for all of this, that something had to begin from all this. And this has been demonstrated more fully. For example, in 1965, two researchers with Bell Labs, Robert Wilson and Arno Penzias, actually discovered a cosmic background radiation. And they had this, the COBE, the Cosmic Background Explorer, and then more recently, the WMAP, where its satellite has given us additional details that are really quite incredible and consistent with an understanding of a hot Big Bang, but it actually points to phenomena that we couldn't have ever guessed before. That 73% of everything we see apparently seems to be dark energy, because the greater the distance, the greater the expansion rate, and what energy is causing that to actually bump up as it goes along. And so we don't have a clue for it, so we call it dark energy. We also see that 23% is dark matter. We don't really know what that is either. We don't know what the strong force is, but we call it the strong force and the weak force. We come with names as if we understood what they fully meant, but it's actually much more profound. So we live in a very curious world, only 4% being ordinary matter. And so it's like curiouser and curiouser, as Alice in Wonderland saw. The more we learn, the more bizarre the cosmos really becomes. And now with the Webb telescope, you're seeing new things that are challenging cosmological theories as well. So we see all of these things going on and so many other factors. Here is the department of entropy, where everything's totally falling apart, you see. And as you know, the second law of thermodynamics tells us that as time goes on, the amount of useful energy wears out. The total amount of energy in mass equivalence density is the same, but the amount of useful energy diminishes as time goes by. It's time zero. And so there's actually an asymptotic movement toward the diminishment of the life itself, the heat death of the universe. But if you go backwards in time, you can't go forever, because you can only go so far. It's like the cosmos was wound up like a clock. And there cannot be more total energy than there is useful energy than there's total energy. So there reaches a point a finite time ago where there had to be a beginning. And either that was a creation event or it was the fall. But at the end of the day, though, it points to a beginning where the whole cosmos was begun in that context. So it becomes more and more consistent. So we have then the idea that the universe had a beginning. And to me, that is profound, because of the way we look at science, faith, and reason. The heart cannot rejoice in what the mind rejects. And when I put these things together, God has wired me in such a way, and I hope you as well, I think all of us should want to have it something that satisfies the mind, but also actually has a fundamental basis, so that the entirety of the person is being addressed. So we see then that this has profound implications. It's an evidence-based commitment that needs to be a reasonable faith. And everyone, including the atheist, has to live by faith. And the only question is the object of that faith warranted by the evidence itself? And so we have to ask ourselves what that looks like. So that's the first feature of the cosmos that it's now increasingly understood, is that it had a beginning point, and there are various reasons why that's becoming more and more evident as we move along. The second feature of the cosmos, or the universe, is its fine-tuning. And Guillermo Gonzalez did a fine job in giving us an understanding of that. And he and Jay Richards have talked about this idea in the privileged planet, the fine-tuning parameters. Others discuss this as well. And so we were dealing with a cosmos in which you have just the right things. It's a just right Goldilocks universe where you have the right particles, you have the right kind of atoms, the right kind of molecules, the right galaxy. It's not just some kind of thing that's random, you see. The right star masses. They have to have the right expansion rate. And just the right star and the right planet and the right moon. And the moon-planet relationship has to be just so as well. And so it looks like that there's been, it's like a clock or a watch that's been perfectly organized and finely tuned. It's not something that was just chaotic, but rather ordered. And so even here with this mindset that with Carl Sagan, when he wrote about the cosmos, at the time he was writing that book, there was the Drake equation that had about 20 parameters for fine-tuning that meant that you could have many planets that would be hospitable to life was the thought. And that there were only a handful of parameters. Since that time, though, dozens, scores, and now apparently hundreds of fine-tuning parameters have been discovered. So for every year, we're discovering new parameters that we didn't see before, and a common sense understanding of the facts suggests, as Fred Hoyle later wrote, that a superintellect has monkeyed with physics and with the laws of chemistry and so forth, because something's going on here that just is counter to anything we could have imagined. And we have new things that we can see, parameters. How is it possible for there to be molecules, let alone life? And the only way there can be atoms and then molecules is to have perfect molecular binding that requires just the right amount of electromagnetic force, a little bit larger, a little bit smaller, and it would not be able to have atoms at all. The ratio of the electron mass to the proton mass is exquisitely fine. The strong nuclear force has to be an extremely precise quotient. And so all of these things kind of work together. And so when you consider the neutron, the force of gravity is extremely refined. And if the neutron were just 0.1% more massive or less massive, then you would have you wouldn't have the elements necessary for life. Or I think about this, the mass ratio of electrons to protons, and it's so finely tuned that it actually is, that the maximum deviation in that mass ratio is 1 part in 10 with 37 zeros after it, which is such an inconceivably great number that it's hard for us to grasp. Hugh Ross tried to do that in one of his books where he imagined, suppose you have the government debt, the U.S. government debt. That's a lovely topic, you see. And at the time he wrote this, the government debt would require 1 square mile of dimes that were just less than 10 feet high. Now we have several, maybe more than 10, 20, 30, 40, but still it's only feet above, and that's a small amount, relatively speaking. When you then consider, suppose you had dimes that extended on the entire surface of the United States, that area, and instead of just going a few feet high, they go all the way up to the moon, 239,000 miles. Now, not double, triple, go up, do it more than that. Make 1 billion of these. So now you have 1 billion United States with the dimes go all the way to the moon. And your job is to now take one of those billion and find the dime in that one there. There's only one that's going to be marked, and that's your probability. It's not a search that you're going to be finding very easily solved. So it's a statistical monstrosity is the idea. It's even worse with the expansion rate of the universe, because if the expansion rate of the universe were 1 part in 10 to the 55 faster or slower, it would have either led to a big crunch immediately, or it would have spun off so fast you wouldn't have had galactic formation at all. So we're talking about a probability that is so minute that it's practically inconceivable. Some have imagined it this way, where you imagine that you have a pencil, and it's on a smooth surface, and it's standing without any help. And then getting 1 million of them to do the same, you're getting close to that proximity of that probability. Try that out. And so it doesn't work really well for us. And so another phenomenon is the whole area of stellar mass. If the ratio of the electromagnetic force to the gravitational force changes by just 1 part in 10 to the 40, again, a 1 with 40 zeros after it, then you'd either have only small stars or only large stars. You wouldn't be able to have the middle-sized stars that are required for life. So even that is a very finely tuned parameter. If you put them all together, indeed, for life to exist, it has to be the right kind of galaxy. So you have a spiral galaxy. It has to be within a spiral galaxy, not an elliptical or an irregular galaxy. Spiral galaxies are the only ones that provide a safe zone for life-sustaining planets. Guillermo talked about the galactic habitable zone. He discusses that, and the idea that there's only one little realm there that's exactly right. Just everything has to be the perfect parameters for this. And so estimates vary, but approximately 20% of all galaxies are spiral and 60% are elliptical. And so you have all these things, and then you have to have the right sun. It has to be a yellow dwarf. It has to have a balance of red and blue, and in the realm of the visible light, a huge percentage of it being in that 4,000 to 7,000 angstroms. So you have this, it has to be a yellow dwarf, it has to be amid a balance of these things, the right metallicity for extraterrestrial planets and so forth. So all of these things work together, a single star system, right luminosity, the right stability, all of these things have to work together. And then indeed there's a circumstellar habitable zone of plus and minus 5%. So you have all these things and you put them together and you try to make some sense out of this. And there are these hundreds of these fine-tuning parameters that can be taken into account. And so conservative estimates, if you take 100 of them and just include the ratio of these things, matter and antimatter, the precise quotient between expansion energy and gravity, resonance energy of carbon, mass density of the universe, the cosmological constant, you begin to add them up and you be assigned very modest estimates for their probability. And even here, you'd get a probability, in some estimates I've seen, 1 chance in 10 to the 215. Now, what happens then if you have many planets? Well, even if you had a generous estimate of 10 to the 22 planets, that reduces our probability to 1 chance in 10 to the minus 193. So I wouldn't put my stake it on it. In fact, what's happening so much is that the evidence for fine-tuning is becoming so profound that now people are desperately going to a multiverse theory. Without any warrant, without any empirical evidence at all, they're willing to violate the first and second laws of thermodynamics in order to embrace the idea that there's ultimately all these things, there are so many infinite number of universes that naturally we are in not just a Goldilocks planet, we just happen to be in one of those planets that is like this. And so now who's living by faith? You see, because it's a tremendous faith proposition. There's no evidence, historical or theoretical or experimental, for anything other than that, but it's really very simple. Physicist Edward Harrison has written, take your choice. Blind chance that requires multitudes of universes, or design that requires only one. So you see this simplicity, the clarity of this. And so going with inference to the best explanation. And not just scientists, but virtually all of us then naturally can determine and infer design. We make inferences to the best explanation all the time. I don't know how many of you have been to Mount Rushmore. I had a chance of going there once to speak at the governor's prayer breakfast in South Dakota. I said, I'm going to do it just because I want to see Mount Rushmore. But when I did that, of course, it's not like north by northwest. You know, there's not an airfield up there and all that. But I love Hitchcock's wonderful film about that. But it's painfully obvious that something's been designed there. It's very, very clear that you're looking at the portions there that were natural in their natural causes. But when you look at the likenesses of the four former American presidents, it points to the design, and we know who it was. It was this Gustin Borglund who spent decades working on this, and it was an achievement of astonishing skill that required very clear things where you use a multiplication in a plumb line, transferring the measurements of a model to the other. It was an incredible achievement. So we have a sense of what that's like. So first of all, the first evidence that I use is the evidence of the universe's beginning, and that there was a beginning time, which is consistent indeed with a biblical vision of what the cosmos is like. It doesn't account for itself. It is contingent. And so then people sometimes, as you know, will ask, but where does God come from? It's a category error because you're trying to put God back in space and time where he transcends them. And so it's a blunder to say, where did God come from? Because you're trying to put him into his own creation in that sense. So he is the one who is the self-existent one. And so he is the one who is the necessary being, who holds all things together and speaks all things out of his. And ultimately, he chooses to create a cosmos that's other than himself, and yet he invades it, he enters into it. So it's an incredible thought. So we have the beginning of the cosmos, we have the fine-tuning of the cosmos, which points to the elegance of a design agency. And then the third feature of the cosmos is biogenesis. Abiogenesis is often called, because how do you get life out of non-life? And you can't appeal at all to the idea of mutations and natural selection. Nothing's alive yet. So we're dealing with the cell itself. And when we consider the exquisitely complex cell, the understanding of what that looks like is it's filled with riches and wonders. And when we consider the Michael Denton observed, it's undirected natural processes somehow have to turn lifeless chemicals into all the extraordinary complexity of living things. And he said that the chemical evolution is no more than the great cosmogenic myth. And so in understanding that, it's this idea of that it's a myth, and the evidence is actually moving more and more to the elegance, not away from. So we see Franklin Harold in The Way of the Cell, who described a single cell organism as a high-tech factory, and complete with artificial languages and their decoding systems and memory banks for information and retrieval, and elegant control systems regulating automatic assembly of plants and components, and error fail-safe and proofreading devices that were utilized for quality control, artificial languages, including assembly processes involving the principle of prefabrication and modular construction, and a capacity not equaled in any of our own most advanced light machines, for it would be capable of replicating its entire structure within a matter of a few hours. There's nothing like this. And the more we learn about it, the more astonishing it becomes. So the so-called simple cell is more amazing than we could have ever imagined. Simple is not. Now, when Darwin and his followers were looking at the cell, they thought of it as a blob of protoplasm, and it would almost be like Lego blocks, so you can understand that and so forth. But actually, it turned out that each Lego had the complexity of a miniature body, and the more you discover it, the more there is no simple cell. And so even design theorists, again, and going back to Thomas Nagel, are beginning to realize that for a long time, as he said, I've been skeptical of the claims of traditional evolutional theory to be the whole story about the history of life. If it implies design, so be it. But the claim that if there's an impossibility for design, you're going to kill science is wrong. And so that's the whole idea. And what would it take to get one single living cell? You can't appeal, as I said, to some Darwinian process because we're dealing with non-living systems. And so Michael Behe's, in Darwin's Black Box, a molecular biologist who revealed much about the self to his readers, shows that there are certainly irreducibly complex components, and the body is filled with these complex wonders and machines. The bacterial flagellum is one of them. And all the components have to be at perfect work and synchrony all at once in order for that to work. And so as a result of X-ray crystallography and nuclear magnetic resonance, we've peered inside that box, and now it's not a black box anymore. And the more we're learning, the more astonishing it's becoming. In fact, it's mind-blowing. So it turns out that God is revealing not less but more of his glory. As skepticism increases, it's fascinating that God, and it's a delicious irony, uses actual technology and advances in science as a demonstration of his actual existence and his authority. So I think it's a wonderful irony indeed. So he's using people who are willing to at least go where the evidence leads. So our understanding of this then is so great that our understanding of cell technology and elegance is far greater than we ever dreamed of before. And we can predict that there are going to be new things that are going to constantly be found that we could not hardly even imagine before. So we just start with one component, for example, the formation of polypeptide amino acids, where they form proteins and these peptide chains, hundreds of amino acids. And so that when they pull these amino acids together, it's a gradual buildup of these polypeptide bonds, precisely ordered sequence. And so that is extremely difficult and becomes a real problem. In fact, people have appealed to some kind of an RNA world. It doesn't work either. But the idea of the complexity of creating one after another, and each one becomes harder for it to be more unstable than before. There are strong components that are involved. Moreover, it's also right and left-handed amino acids. So they're stereoisomers that they have left and right hand. And what's astonishing and fascinating to me is that all organic molecules are left-handed. And the difference between them and the mirror symmetry is just the left hand versus the right hand. But amino acids in all living beings consist of left-handed amino acids. And so it's an amazing thought that you have all these components that are astonishing. And what would be the probability? How would you ever be able to get them all to be left-handed? But like taking a fair coin and flipping it 400 times. And it turns out left every time. Would you not get suspicious about that coin? Is it really a fair coin, you see? But you're dealing with, and there are much bigger proteins than 400. And so you're dealing with something that's such a statistical monstrosity, as I say before, that there are now, this appeals to an RNA world hypothesis. But you've got to have both the proteins, but you also have the DNA and RNA. You need to have both of them at the same time. And so you have a chicken and an egg problem, among other things. And you have to have more than that. You have to have lipids to form a membrane, complex carbohydrates, building a cell wall, essential genetic products. All these things, and then epigenetic component that's not even in the DNA. So that's all these things work together. So it's caused some people then, and another desperation, and it's interesting how people retreat to irrationality to avoid the obvious implications of God. And as I now think of it, people want to have something that's transcendent, but they don't want it to be personal. So that at the end of the day, they want, because then they're accountable. And so there's a fundamental autonomous dynamic that's going on where people can try to say that he doesn't exist, but it doesn't work very well at all. And it doesn't, so some people have actually, when you look at again by the way, the primary and secondary, tertiary, and quaternary structures of the topography of how these proteins fold. We can't do it. We don't understand it. But it actually adds more information than the three-dimensional topography of these proteins. So they are beyond imagination in terms of their complexity and elegance. And so all of these things really are if you're appealing to something without a designing agency, you have a real problem. Because it turns out, for example, that the DNA is the most exquisitely engineered communication protocol in all of existence. And so the more we learn, the more amazing it becomes. The fourth feature, besides the beginning of the cosmos, it has an origin, that secondly, it is finely tuned for life, and then third, the dynamic of the beginning of life itself and how it would be possible for you to get one living cell. The impossibility of that is information theory. But it led to this mindset of directed panspermia before we get there, because you see some people said, okay, it couldn't have evolved on Earth. Maybe it came from outer space. You see, and that's a desperate measure indeed. But sometimes some scientists don't make the best philosophers, because the obvious question is, where did that come from? So you're just pushing it back one step, you see. So it doesn't really answer your problem at all. So, but there's such a mystery that but anything but God is going to be the mindset. I look at things like a rock cairn, and again, inference is the best explanation. I can see something like that, and what do I conclude when I see that? Some design agency going on there, But this is child's play compared to any component of a living system. Child's play. But we, again, realize that it's something more, that there's much more than that. The fourth feature of the cosmos, of the world I want us to point out, is information theory. And I want us to look at this fourth feature. Our bodies are rich in information, and there can be no sudden infusion of complex information through undirected natural processes. Where does this information come from? And so we have beautiful natural patterns that we can see. We see them in snowflakes, we see them in crystals, we see them in sand dunes, hurricanes, tornadoes, stalagmites, stalactites, and so forth. Nature abounds also with fractal systems that are rich in their beauty and these natural patterns, the Mandelbrot and the Julia sets related to chaos theory. So these are elegant patterns that go on, it seems, forever. But pattern is not the same as design. And that's what I want to see, is to draw an important distinction. Because these patterns don't have information, because a pattern is different than a design. So unlike a fractal, if you're dealing with music, or if you're dealing with maps, or if you're dealing with instructions, now you're dealing with something dramatically different. Human language is the way, as computer language and of course DNA, all of these things work together, and you begin to see that these are things that point to something else. It's a complex system that's rich in information, that has a symbolic interpretation of a physical thing. There's a semiotics where it points to a thing. And in doing that, we see that all of these things work together in a map of reality. A map of Italy has information as a code. It corresponds to something real. So your DNA is the most exquisitely engineered communication protocol in existence. We can conclude that we're going to be seeing a paradigm shift as I see it. But the paradigm shift won't be toward atheism, but probably to some kind of panpsychism, because they don't want God, ultimate reality, to be a person. But at the end of the day, though, basically the neo-Darwinian synthesis of mutations and natural selection is not standing up to the evidence that continues to grow, and against a simplistic understanding that produces. So DNA is a language, and so we have to ask the question, where does it come from? So when you're looking at the double helix structure, it has an alphabet and it contains rich information. There's 3.2 billion nucleotide pairs. And they link together to form genes. And so when we look at these things, we see these are actual letters. And that these letters, the thymine and the adenine and the guanine and the cytosine, are actual letters. And every three of them form a code. And the codon then forms a word. And then that word, the codon, corresponds to genes, which correspond to sentences. And then the chromosomes correspond to chapters. And then you have the whole genome as the book. So where does information come from is the question we have to ask. One single cell can carry more data than all the volumes of the Encyclopedia Britannica. I remember having a set of those when I was a kid. You see, haven't opened it in many years. But it's rich in information, is it not? And it's child's play when we can compare with the genetic code. Entirely different form of information that transcends the genome. So the DNA, just a rich amount of information. And it requires something. It requires a communicator. It has to have a speaker, has to have a transmitter, has to have a listener or receiver. And so it's a language that actually corresponds to something that is actually very real, that people can understand. But when we see even when we have a language, it's still not enough, because you see there are different levels in our language. For example, a person could say it has to have an alphabet, it has to have a syntax, it has to be meaning, it has to have intent. So I can say, he didn't steal that car. But you see that it's different from saying he didn't steal that car and he didn't steal that car. So it's the same sentence, but it's different intention. So the same sentence can mean something different according to the intended meaning, which brings us now to the next level, which is intentionality. because the lower cannot account for the higher. Only the higher can account for the lower. And suppose you have a green light, you see. And so you see this green light, but at the end of the day, the green light could mean something more than one thing. It could mean you have get moving, your light's green. Or you could have a green light on a project. And so you're dealing with intentionality, what is meant. So the context, the syntax, the semiotics, all those things. The lower can never account for the higher, but the higher can always account for the lower. And that's what we're looking at. Norbert Wiener was an MIT mathematician. He was the father of modern cybernetics. He put it this way. He said, information is information, neither matter nor energy, and any materialism that fails to take this into account will not survive one day. So the point again is that we're dealing with intentionality, and information transcends matter and energy. It's a third ultimate, and it's a strange thing. In this sense here, we look at what this means for us. Right now, I'm having a talk with you, and it's being recorded. And what can we do with that? We can turn the information into an MP3 or an MP4, and you can send that electronic transmission to another computer, perhaps. The computer can open it up, and you can hear it, or someone could transcribe it. And so at that juncture, you could either read it or you could print it out. So in some contexts, it's energy, and sometimes it's matter. You see, but it's the same information which transcends the matter and energy. This is why it's interesting when you have a DVD and it has a film on it. It doesn't weigh more or less if it has a film or not. Because information transcends the medium itself. It transcends the matter and energy. So it's a kind of a third ultimate that is, and in the beginning was the Word, the Logos, and the mind that called it all into being. So it's something that transcends both matter and energy. It's very mysterious. So this fundamental question is this: show me a message that doesn't come from a mind, a coherent, comprehensive message. And so we have this idea, because even when we're dealing with ChatGPT-4, we're dealing with something that's derivative from human consciousness, from human minds. And if it continued just to feed on itself, it would decay. But it requires new infusions from actual minds and actual thought thinkers. So we're dealing here with something that's quite remarkable, that random mutations do not account for it, but there's a kind of a promissory materialism. So if I look at the components of your life, your body consists of your cells and your tissues and your organs and your systems, and all of these things work synergistically in your life. They fit together in ways, but the lower can never account for the higher. Now, I've talked with people about these things. And remember, one atheist I talked to in Dallas was describing how, okay, it seems so, but that we just need to have a scientific explanation and how we can get that information. There's got to be a materialist explanation for how we can get it. What I call that promissory materialism, you see, because the lower can't account for the higher. And so the promissory materialism is eventually we will have scientific evidence that will help us understand why it appears the way it is right now as more of a mind. So now who's living by faith once again, you see, because it's a desperate measure of faith without evidence to avoid the obvious implication of design. So we have all these things in my mind that work together, a variety of features of the world. So we have the evidence for the universe's beginning. You have the evidence for the fine-tuning of the cosmos. The evidence, third, for the impossibility of biogenesis. And fourth, the nature of information itself. And we live in an information-rich world, and your body is rich in that complexity. And beyond our imagination or ability to even understand, we are not smart enough to know how our brains work. So everything is, the more we learn, the more astonishing it becomes, not the less. It becomes more amazing. And then there are other features of the world as well that we can consider. Human consciousness, the feature of rationality that has to be taken into account, moral values and opinions. And when people deny having consciousness, it's a self-defeating thing again, because what is the thing that's making the claim that I have no consciousness? So people are, it's a kind of a self-refuting philosophies of life, but again, people are so desperate to avoid the idea of an ultimate person who would be transcendent to whom we must give an account. There seems to be these qualities. But when we look at these things that are given to us, moral values and obligations are very real, and we can't just deny them. Beauty. Where is the source of beauty? What's the source and basis for human dignity and value and purpose? Human rights as well. And the universal religious experiences. So all of these things have profound implications, it seems to me, for the inescapable conclusions of naturalism, in which we're now seeing that design really points to a designer. And the more we see, the more we're going to be able to see. It's interesting to me, by the way, that it was in the 17th century, the century in which the so-called Enlightenment took place, that God actually bumped up the evidence in that context by having the microscope and the macroscope. In other words, the invention of the microscope and the telescope in that century are intriguing to me, because for the first time in human history, there was a force multiplier for what people didn't even know existed. They didn't know that there was a microscopic world, as we now know there is, because we didn't have that ability. Nor did we have a multiplier for what was above, because we could only see a few thousand stars, and now we didn't know anything. I didn't know, I couldn't imagine. So we are seeing here that as skepticism increases, because with the so-called Enlightenment, there was a movement away from the revelation of God's world, and as a consequence, a movement passing through deism, a kind of a transitional worldview, so there'd be less cognitive dissonance as we move from basically a theistic to a physicalistic, materialistic world. And so as we do that, the fascinating thing is that God bumps up the ante of evidence. Pascal once said that God has apportioned the evidence in such a way that there's enough evidence to satisfy the mind of a person who believes, but also to enable the person who rejects the evidence to rationalize his disbelief. So what happens when disbelief bumps up? When the natural default now is no longer theism, but an anti-theism? What happens? God ironically builds up the evidence, and he's using, and again, that delicious irony, he's using actual science. He's using technology to do it. And so he's revealing himself, and it's going up exponentially. And the more we learn, guess what? We learn enough to know we didn't have a clue before what we thought we knew. And then when you know more, then now there's 10 new things I didn't know enough to ask about. And then another thing, and God actually works it in such a way that he is always ahead of us, gives us a clue, and when we go through that, we see, there's much more. And it keeps on going further and further down, like these Russian Matryoshka dolls, that there's embedded mysteries and wonders and so forth. I'm confident you'll never plumb the depths of the mystery we call God. You see, the more we learn about him, we're seeing this now. Wait till you see the next creation, the new creation. Wait till you see an unfallen world, you see. You haven't seen anything yet. And so here we have a doxological vision of a God who's made us for himself. And he calls us to that relationship and that fundamental connection between the two. So they are inescapable conclusions of a naturalistic philosophy. And I'll just tie these threads and leave them for you. If naturalism is true, then I give you several inescapable conclusions. One of them is that there would be no transcendent or spiritual dimension, so that there would be ultimate reality consists of merely matter and energy and space and time, but where they came from cannot be answered. The second implication is that there's no life after death. All of human life is a brief episode between two oblivions. They're just here for a cosmic blip, and you're gone. You see, you'll hear the statement, but you'll be remembered by the people that knew and loved you. Woody Allen was asked in a Rolling Stone magazine interview if he wanted to live on in the hearts of his friends. He says, no, I want to live on in my own apartment. What good will it be with them? Because there won't be anyone to remember you either, and no one will remember them, and so it will go. If that's your basis for meaning, you built your platform on the firm foundation, as Bertrand Russell put it, of unyielding despair. You see, you have nothing to build upon. And so what happens when your friends die? We have an aspiration, I believe it's wired in us by the living God, from whom and through whom and to whom are all things, for more than that. We long for more than that. If there's no life after death, we're basically food for the worms. And at the end of the day, then we have this third thought, no absolute foundation for right and wrong, because you see, there would be, if not only would be no God and no life after death, be simply a matter of preference, because you can't say National Socialism was wrong in Hitler's regime, because at the end of the day, what's your idea of evil? In order for you to have evil, there'd have to be an absolute for good. So you can't have it both ways. And so ultimately, you're dealing with because his idea was rigorously consistent with that notion of eliminating the weaker races in favor of the Aryans, which was really picked up from the descent of man. So that the whole idea of this notion, what do you say why would that be evil? And furthermore, you are admitting that people can get away with murder forever. So it's not a moral universe. Whereas the scriptures tell us no one's going to get away with murder. At the end of the day, that God can't forgive sins, but he can forgive the sinner. And that's the genius and the amazing thing. The one who gives us meaning is the one who took our guilt. So the concept of that is so radically rich by comparison, because we can say it is a moral universe, whereas the atheist cannot say so. And it's an absurdity, you see. You can't turn an is into an ought. And then people, that might be true for you, but not for me. But try that with your bank. So you have a check returned and they claim that you have only $30 in your account. You say, that may be true for you, but not for me. It doesn't work very well, We know better than that. See how far that'll get you. Or I always love this when people claim to be moral, they don't have a morality, or that they don't have an absolute code of morality, they're moral relatives. It's always fun then when somebody cuts in line in front of them, and then the relativist becomes an absolutist immediately. Who told you you could get in there? Well, what's your basis? I believe in social Darwinism. Might makes right. So what, you have a problem? And I wouldn't do this unless it was huge. But at the end of the day, though, the guy has no valid argument for claiming that you are wrong, you see. Might makes right. And so you can see that people cannot live in a manner that's consistent with the logical implications of a non-theistic presupposition. You can't live that way, because we were wired for more. We were wired for beauty and goodness and truth, for transcendence, top down. Another inescapable conclusion of naturalism is no ultimate meaning for life. Life would be an absurdity. It'd be a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing, as Macbeth would put it. We're in a quest for meaning, though. We are in a quest for purpose. And life without that, with meaning, purpose, and reality, is not a rich life. We discovered the most meaningful thing of all is relationships at the end of the day. And it's the greatest source of pleasure and good, but it's also the source of great pain as well. And so ultimately then God is the ultimate relational being, who is the one who pursues you and me, who are in rebellion against him, and calls us into a relationship by underwriting our cost by the incarnation of his Son, and who came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. The one who came then to give his life, and so that ultimately he is the one who gives us meaning. He is the sacred romancer who woos his beloved, who purchases her, who pursues her, who protects her, who provides for her. And so that is the God that we can see is the lover of your souls. And ultimate reality then is a loving being, a personhood, a person that you can get to know and have a relationship with. Another implication of naturalism is that there's no free will, because if you stop and think about it, they are the products of their selfish genes. But we can't live as if we don't have free wills, and those who claim it, even when they write a book about not having free wills, are using, what gave them the ability to write that book, you see? So they're making choices. So they can't live that way. People live better than their worldviews because they are bearers of the Imago Dei. He has planted eternity in your heart, Ecclesiastes 3:11. And so you are God-haunted. Even the atheist is God-haunted, you see. And so there's much more because we recognize. So the design pointing to a designer is the ultimate vision of what life's meant to be about. So the implications are profound. And I think about this idea. It's one of my favorite. I love these turreted eyes and so forth, these wonderful creatures. But I think that, so the whole idea of God paying the price to overcome the alienation we had with him, that he is the one who pursued us, wooed us, and called us. The one who made us is also the one who redeems us. And so I kind of conclude with this rich statement from Thomas Merton. And when he said, we're not at peace with one another because we're not at peace with ourselves. And we're not at peace with ourselves because we're not at peace with God. And that summarizes an awful lot right there. So when we have a right relationship with God, it overcomes the fourfold alienation between our God and ourselves and God, ourselves and ourselves, ourselves and others, and ourselves in the created order. So then he begins a process in this third act of creation and fall, and then the third act of redemption, where we're beginning to see the intimations of the act to come. So the least of heaven is better than the best of earth. And so the best is yet to come, and God redeems what he allows. We live in a moral, spiritual, and real universe. And so at the end of the day, we acknowledge his love and grace, and we discover that we find our lives, how? By losing them and finding him, and Christ becomes our life. And that is a life well worth living. It's a life worth pursuing. It's a life worth emulating. And it's a life of meaning and purpose and joy. And if we are infused with the internal qualities of Christ in us through the mediating of the Holy Spirit, so that you live a life of love and joy and peace and patience and kindness and goodness and faithfulness and gentleness and self-control, I find someone like that, I want to be with them. Because that's the person, that's the shortest summary of the life of Christ I know, those 9 words, those phrases. So you and I are meant to be people who please God. At the end of the day, you will be an element in the divine pleasure, so that we long to get in. And as Lewis puts it so beautifully in his Weight of Glory, one day the door on which we are knocking will open at last, and we will find that the one who made us is the one who remade us and brought us into conformity with the image of his Son. I think I'm out of time. Yep.